I only wish that my sidekick, Jay Silverheels, could be with me tonight. Wonderful man to work with and a great friend. I used to listen to Jay Silverheels' Indian prayer. Jay often said to me, "How about doing the Lone Ranger Creed for me, Clay?"
For 30 years, Clayton Moore was the Lone Ranger, America's most trusted hero. He was adored by children, revered by millions, and an icon of the American West. His face, hidden behind a mask, became synonymous with everything good, honorable, and just. But behind the camera, beyond the lens of that iconic image, there was another story, one that few ever saw and fewer still understood. By the time Clayton Moore passed away in 1999, almost no one remembered the man he once was. Not even Moore himself. What the public believed was his unwavering dedication to the role was actually something much darker. An identity slowly and methodically erased over a lifetime. A transformation so complete that by the end, the man and the mask were indistinguishable. This is the untold story of Clayton Moore, the man who wore the mask and the mask that ultimately consumed him. Born Jack Carlton Moore on September 14, 1914 in Chicago, Illinois, he was always different. From a young age, Clayton was an outsider, a quiet, introspective boy who saw the world with solemn eyes. His parents were ordinary, far removed from the glitz and glamour of show business. They offered him the security of a working-class upbringing, but little fame, and even less certainty about the future. He was a dreamer, captivated by the silent films of the day, by the trapeze artists, acrobats, and the masked heroes who seemed to speak with their actions rather than words. It was a kind of poetry in motion, a form of expression that resonated with his reserved soul. According to his biography, Clayton found this world far safer than the noisy chaos of the playground. The heroes on screen didn't shout to be heard. They let their deeds speak for them, and that silent heroism was something he deeply admired. As a teenager, Clayton made a bold decision. He joined a traveling circus as an acrobat. There, he found the risk, the discipline, and the constant balancing of his body against gravity to be invigorating. He learned how to fall and rise again, to trust his body when his mind quaked with doubt. Under the big top, amidst the ropes and nets, Clayton finally found a sense of belonging. He wasn't just Jack from Chicago anymore, he was someone extraordinary, someone lighter than himself. The circus gave him the freedom to express himself in ways he'd never imagined. After the circus, Clayton moved to New York, where he worked as a model for John Robert Powers, posing for photos, attending fashion shows, and smiling beneath the glare of bright lights. But no matter how glamorous the work seemed, it never satisfied him. His heart longed for something more. Something that would allow him to be more than just a pretty face in front of the camera. The modeling world felt like a cage to him, as if he were invisible in the very spotlight that others seemed to crave. He wanted to be a hero, a man of action. So, in the late 1930s, he made his way to Hollywood with nothing but hope and a few dollars in his pocket. In Hollywood, Clayton worked as a stuntman, taking on dangerous physical jobs that others avoided. He doubled for actors, fell from heights, and took the beatings no one else wanted. For Clayton, each stunt was a test, not just of his body, but of his will to push forward. In 1940, Hollywood producer Edward Small convinced him to change his stage name to Clayton Moore, a name that felt stronger, more fitting for a hero than the one he'd been born with. With this new name, he began landing small but significant roles in B-westerns and serials. His role in The Ghost of Zorro, where he donned a mask, marked the beginning of a transformation that would define the rest of his career. Then, World War II came. Clayton enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Forces and was assigned to the 1st Motion Picture Unit, where he helped produce training films. Even in uniform, Moore felt a strange detachment from the realities of battle. He helped create messages of courage, discipline, and sacrifice for soldiers, but his heart was never far from the idea of heroism, an idea he would continue to explore on screen. In 1945, after the war, Clayton returned to a Hollywood that had changed dramatically. The television revolution was just beginning, and the studios were beginning to realize the medium wasn't just a passing trend, it was the future. Moore found himself back in low-budget productions, playing forgettable roles in serials like The Crimson Ghost and The Adventures of Frank and Jesse James. These projects paid the bills, but they did little to elevate his career. However, they did help him solidify his presence in the Western and action genres, fields that would prove crucial. Meanwhile, in another part of town, producer George W. Trendle faced a challenge. His radio program, The Lone Ranger, had been an overwhelming success since its debut in 1933. But as television began to rise, he knew the Lone Ranger would need to make the leap to the small screen if it was to survive. The question was, who could bring this beloved character to life on television? Who could embody the hero millions had imagined for over a decade? The casting process wasn't like typical Hollywood auditions. Trendle wasn't looking for just anyone who could look good on a horse. He needed someone who could embody American values: integrity, honor, moral clarity. The wrong actor could destroy everything the character represented. Clayton Moore's name surfaced early in the process. His experience in westerns, his proven stunt abilities, and his professionalism made him a strong candidate. But it was something else that made Moore stand out: his commitment to every role he played, no matter how small. Moore brought a rare earnestness to the material, an authenticity that felt true, not forced. In 1949, Clayton Moore was cast as the Lone Ranger. The preparation for the role was intense. He was measured for the iconic white Stetson hat, the black mask, the carefully crafted Western outfit that would become instantly recognizable. He met Silver, the white stallion, who would become as famous as the character himself. Clayton spent weeks training not just to ride, but to ride with the authority and grace the role demanded. On September 15, 1949, The Lone Ranger premiered on ABC. Its impact was immediate and profound. The show captured the attention of families across the nation. Children rushed home from school to watch. Parents appreciated the wholesome content and moral clarity. Suddenly, Clayton Moore wasn't just an actor. He was a cultural phenomenon. Merchandise exploded. Lunchboxes, toy guns, masks, costumes. Moore, meanwhile, immersed himself in the Lone Ranger's ethical code, applying its principles to his own life. He stopped smoking in public, made himself available to fans, and conducted himself as if the Lone Ranger's moral code were his own responsibility. By 1951, Clayton Moore had finally achieved the recognition he had longed for. But with that recognition came a cost. The more famous he became as the Lone Ranger, the less visible Clayton Moore became as a man. The mask that made him a hero also made him invisible. Neither he nor Hollywood was prepared for what would come next. By 1952, Clayton Moore had become one of the most recognizable figures in television. But Hollywood saw him only as the Lone Ranger. Every audition for other roles, whether dramatic or character-driven, was met with rejection. Studios could not separate the man from the mask. The irony was crushing. Moore had spent 15 years fighting for recognition, taking any role he could get, building a career from scratch. Now that he had achieved fame, it had become his prison. Every rejection told him the same thing. He was the Lone Ranger, and he would never be anything else. The more he struggled to break free from the role, the more deeply it defined him. He had adopted the Lone Ranger's moral code as his own, lived by it every day. The boundaries between performer and performance had dissolved so completely that even Moore himself seemed unsure where one ended and the other began. The financial realities were just as grim. Though The Lone Ranger was a hit, Moore wasn't getting rich from it. His contract terms were standard for 1950s television. Modest pay for the iconic character he had created. When the show ended its original run in 1957, Moore found himself in an agonizing position. Famous enough to be unemployable in other roles, but not wealthy enough to retire. He took guest appearances on television, always playing variations of the same Western hero. He signed autographs, posed for photos, and appeared at conventions. But the enthusiasm that once fueled his commitment had turned into a grim obligation. By the early 1960s, Moore had become a tragic figure. He had achieved everything he once dreamed of, yet the price of that dream was the total annihilation of his identity. The man Clayton Moore had once been no longer existed. He had become a ghost, a shell, defined entirely by the character he had brought to life. The tragedy deepened in 1979 when the Rather Corporation, which owned the rights to the Lone Ranger, decided that the aging Moore was no longer suitable for public appearances in the role. They feared that his presence would confuse audiences and interfere with their marketing of a new Lone Ranger film starring a younger actor. They issued a cease and desist order, forbidding Moore from wearing the mask or identifying himself as the Lone Ranger. Moore's response was not to fight for financial compensation. He simply asked to continue wearing the mask in public appearances, something that would allow him to maintain his connection to the fans who still saw him as their childhood hero. The corporation refused, and Moore found himself in a legal battle that further confirmed the depth of his connection to the character. His attorneys argued that after 30 years of embodying the Lone Ranger, Moore had earned some right to the persona he had helped create. The Rather Corporation countered that Moore was simply an employee, paid for his work decades earlier. In 1981, the court ruled against Moore. He was forbidden from wearing the black domino mask in public. The symbol that had defined him for 30 years was now legally off-limits. Moore, in an act of quiet defiance, appeared at his next public event wearing large sunglasses, a substitute for the mask that still allowed him to maintain some connection to the character. The sunglasses became his new trademark, a dignified compromise. But those who knew Moore saw something different. Behind the dark glasses, they saw a man who had been broken, slowly fading away behind a facade he could no longer escape. The public admired his grace under pressure, but the truth was darker. Moore was trapped in a performance that no longer belonged to him. As the years went on, Moore continued to make public appearances, still embodying the Lone Ranger, still maintaining the moral standards he had adopted long ago. But privately, the toll of the mask had become unbearable. The boundaries between the man and the character had dissolved completely. The mask had consumed him, and in the end, Clayton Moore had become the Lone Ranger. Nothing more, nothing less. In his final years, Moore expressed a deep fear. He no longer knew where Clayton Moore ended and the Lone Ranger began. He was convinced that the man he had been had disappeared sometime in the 1950s, replaced entirely by the persona he had created. In the end, the mask had given him everything he had ever wanted: fame, recognition, respect. But it had also taken everything he had ever been. Clayton Moore's life was the story of a man who gave everything to become someone else, only to disappear in the process.